Hello and welcome back to The Editorial, the podcast where we discuss the decisions that TLDR makes and respond to controversial videos we've made.
Yeah, see how
contentious.
Contentious, and see how well we've stuck by stated principle of neutrality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this episode is largely in response to the video we did about ethnic Russians in Europe.
Yeah.
It received some pushback, most notably a fairly lengthy Twitter thread that we did respond to on Twitter.
Yeah.
But we also wanted to respond to more fully.
I also think we always planned on bringing this back. I know it's been a while because both of us have been busy, but we did want to get back into the habit of doing the editorial.
What a lovely excuse.
It's a dual purpose.
Go for it. Explain the situation and what was claimed.
Sure. So let's just start with the video itself. I think last week we released a video titled "Is the Russian Minority in the EU Being Persecuted?" With the thumbnail "Are Baltic Russians Being Persecuted?" The video itself was mostly about a dispute between the Latvian government and the UN over some recent laws passed by the Latvian government regarding Russian-speaking public education in Latvia. And I think we always knew this was going to be a bit of a controversial topic for sort of obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But it actually went down pretty uncontentiously on YouTube, but on Twitter, Bad Baltic Takes, a little shout out to Bad Baltic Takes here, did a thread apparently by popular demand explaining everything that was wrong with the video. And I think actually he made some really good points. He or she, I don't know, I'm assuming that they made some really good points. And in retrospect, there were parts of the video that were just lacking.
Okay.
And I think this is especially true on the history side. I'm just, we always say explanation not an excuse. Just getting ready to say that so many times.
Okay.
So, but yeah, on the history front. So I think our retelling of Baltic history was just not up to scratch. And a lot of this revolves around the notion of state continuity for the Baltic states.
Okay.
So this relies on a distinction between what you might call de facto and de jure. So de facto, so in practice, the Soviets, the Baltic states were sort of part of the Soviet Union. At the time, everyone treated them as part of the Soviet Union. The maps that were drawn include them as part of the Soviet Union. The UN didn't treat them as like individual countries. But in retrospect, most legal scholars, there's a sort of legal consensus that the Baltic states were never actually part of the Soviet Union. Instead, it's true to say that they were occupied.
Okay.
So that basically from the period after the Second World War up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, they weren't part of the Soviet Union. They were. It's better to say that they were occupied, and that's essentially because the Russians or the Soviet Union didn't. I mean, the Russians essentially agreed to the Baltic states' independence after the First World War, and then basically violently occupied them after the second one. And I didn't know about that. I did not know that is what the legal consensus was. What legal scholars think, and I can only apologise for that. So that is my bad, and I am really sorry about that. That's not good enough from us. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So we didn't even make that clear in the video. We didn't mention it in the video, and that's obviously a relevant part of Baltic history. That's also important for the video because that sort of relates to how you might interpret the citizenship laws that were passed over after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in the video, we talk about these citizenship laws that were passed over after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which essentially required, I think it was at least Latvia, if you want to get Latvian citizenship, you had to prove that you had sort of Latvian heritage, as it were.
Sure.
Not Russian. And that, if you don't know about the state continuity of the Baltic states, that can look a little bit questionable. That sort of at least superficially discriminatory citizenship law.
Okay.
But if you accept the state continuity of the Baltic states, then it's far less contentious because actually what you're doing there is the Russians who came over weren't like Latvians in the sense they were occupiers.
Yes.
And that, if anything, this is just more about preserving the pre-existing citizenship of the people who lived in Latvia, assuming the Latvian state sort of never went away, as it were. So I think that's the main thing that we got wrong there. And yeah, we just have to apologize for that. I am sorry. And we did get that wrong. The other thing, I think he's made a couple of other points that I think are worth addressing and that I probably agree with. The first one is, again, on the history of the expulsion. So in it, we mentioned the wave of expulsion that occurred. So basically, ethnic Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were expelled and, in many cases, taken to essentially gulags in Siberia. And this happened in 2 waves. And in the video, we only really acknowledged the second wave. The second wave was the largest wave, but there was a wave in sort of 1940, 41, and then there was a second wave in 1945, 46. And in justifying the second wave expulsions, the Soviets often used the language, basically accused them of being Nazi sympathizers in many cases. And we only mentioned that wave. But of course, the first wave, you couldn't justify it by making reference to Nazi sympathies, and it was motivated by ethnic and separatist concerns. So we missed that out as well, and I think that is relevant. And so yeah, again, apology there. Not even explanation here.
Just apology.
Just apologies. And then the last bit that I agree with is, and I think this is just a sort of a misspeaking more than anything else, but there's a point when we're evaluating the laws, we're evaluating the new laws insofar as how they affect Baltic state security, because that's how we frame the video. We say that the main rationale for these laws is one of security, and I think that's still true, and I think that's the language that Baltic politicians usually use. But we basically say these laws might make a Ukraine-style retaliation more likely, and I understand how that language does seem to sort of place, as it were, responsibility on the Baltic states. Do you see what I mean? It's sort of like it's a weird use of language. It's victim blaming in a sense. Isn't it? And I think we could be more careful with the language. I think there's a sort of obviously like a trivially true point about how these sort of language laws affect Baltic-Russian relations. But I think he's right to point out, or they are right, Bad Baltic Takes is right to point out that sort of language does seem to, it sort of at least subtly implies blame. And probably should be more careful with that sort of language. So that's the place I think he's right. They are right, I don't know. And the places I think I would push back on is not to do with the history, but to do with the recent laws themselves.
Before you answer that, I'm interested. From a history perspective, we always say, because these are sometimes critiques we get on other topics too, when it comes to history, the detail of history, specific events people would like us to cover. I mean, sometimes we just get things wrong, but a lot of the time the response is there just isn't space. It's an 8-minute video. Only so much of it can be history. We only will talk about the stuff we deem to be relevant to the story we're eventually getting to. So how much is this a case of that? And also, are there any changes to how we will report on the historic elements of videos as a reaction to this and kind of broader trends?
So I think that's, of course, true. When you're doing an 8-minute video, there's only so much you can include. But I think in the cases I just mentioned, even given that restraint, or restriction rather, we still should mention those things. So I don't think that really changes anything. I think it was more just that even given the constraints we're dealing with, we should have mentioned those things. That constraint is real though. And for example, Bad Baltic Takes also argues that we should have talked more about the sort of the nuances of the Russian-speaking population in the Baltic states. And there, I would say that an 8-minute video just doesn't allow that. For starters, there's not great polling on it. It's also worth saying that we do make a distinction between the Estonian and Latvian populations and how the Russian-speaking populations in those 2 countries do think about Russia differently. But yeah, that fundamentally, there just isn't space to really get into a detailed conversation about the nuances of the attitudes of the Russian-speaking populations in those Baltic countries. So I don't think we'll really change how we do it in the future. It's a real constraint, but I still think given that constraint, we should have included some of the stuff that was mentioned. And also some of it doesn't take long. Like I think that like, for example, the expulsion stuff, I mean, that's an added sentence, just to make sure. It might even mean less of a sentence because we wouldn't have put in the thing about Nazi sympathies. We'd have just mentioned the 2 waves of expulsion and talked about how they were ethnically motivated. But yeah, that constraint is real, although I just don't think it really excuses it in this case.
Okay.
Yeah. The bit I would push back on then. So I think we made quite a few mistakes on the history, and another apology there. But I think there's a second accusation in the tweet thread where Bad Baltic Tate says that we're engaging in two-sidism. So he's talking about the bit towards the end of the video where we say, because we're neutral channel, we're going to present both sides.
Yeah.
And he says that actually, that you can't engage in this sort of both sidesism when one side is Kremlin propaganda and the other is just the facts on the ground, the truth about the Baltic states. And I just don't think that's a fair representation of what we're doing when we say we're going to present both sides, because in that particular instance, we're presenting the UN side, and the UN human rights experts are saying that Latvia's new language laws do violate human rights charters that Latvia is party to, and the Latvian government's side. And the Latvian government's argument is basically that these human rights charters that the Latvian government is party to do not impose an obligation on the Latvian government to provide public education in minority languages. And this is genuinely a really difficult philosophical question. I think anyone who says that there's an easy answer here is why is just a bit confused about this, because of course, taken to its extreme, that's true. We don't expect any state to provide public education in every minority language in that country. You know what I mean? Like, the UK would be a mess. Otherwise, we would have to provide like 1 million different languages in schools. But there's clearly a point at which a minority becomes not just so large, but also culturally significant, at which point we do expect the state to provide some sort of accommodation in their public education policies. I mean, that might be defined by percentage. I don't know what the answer is to this. I don't know when a minority reaches that threshold. It's probably a function of a variety of variables. So it's probably a function of just the size of the minority. So, the Russian minority in Latvia is 20% of the population or whatever. That's pretty big. It's probably not sufficient condition, because in my head I'm imagining if a load of French people moved here, like if 15 million French people moved here, we wouldn't start being like, okay, we're doing French language education now. So it's probably a function of both the size of the minority, that's a funny image, the size of the minority, and also sort of the history and the context in which they arrived there. And I just don't think there's an easy answer to that question. And I think hopefully we do that fact justice in the second part of the video. But that's, the headline here. God, I just speak in script language now. It's sad. The headline here is that we definitely made some mistakes, especially with the history, and as a function of ignorance on my part. And I am sorry about that. And we are sorry. So not even any explanation there. And we would push back on the second bit about the two-sidism, but we still made mistakes, and we should still be doing slightly better than that.
Sure.
Nice. I think that's sort of everything, isn't it?
Okay.
What do you want to do? Do you want to do?
I don't know.
Well, I think we can't go back, because in the editorial, at least in theory, we're supposed to go back over all the videos since the last editorial.
Yeah, but that's been months.
That's chaos.
Yeah, we can't do that. That's crazy.
We could talk about today's video.
Sure. Today being Wednesday.
Yeah.
Wednesday, the 24th of May.
Yeah, and we've put out a video today about what happened in Belgorod, and the title is Ukraine invades Russia, what just happened in Belgorod. And the thumb title is Why did Ukraine invade Russia? And we've got a bit of pushback on this because obviously the Ukrainian government has denied responsibility for what happened in Belgorod yesterday and the day before. I'm completely sympathetic to that, and in some sense this is about thumbnails again and titles, and it's not just that we want to have a clicky title and a clicky thumbnail. That's just the truth of the matter, and that's just what the commercial incentives demand, unfortunately. But it's also that Daily Briefing did the story yesterday, and we talked about this in the office. We need to differentiate a bit, and they've taken Russia invades Russia. And
which is a good title.
It's a great title. And so we sort of had to do Ukraine invades Russia. And I also think we sort of justify the title in the video by talking about how this is all about plausible deniability. This is about Ukraine doing enough to make sure that Putin can't justify sort of an asymmetrical escalation.
Yeah.
And that actually, even while Zelensky and Kiev might deny it like that, other Ukrainian officials are pretty open about the fact that Ukraine and Kiev definitely has some handle in these sorts of things. A good example of this, by the way, is that the Russian Volunteer Corps let this slip a while ago when they said, "Now we are part of the Ukrainian armed forces," and then Kiev said, "No, you're not," which is a funny little miscommunication. But I think, and the other thing I mentioned in that video is that this is something that Zelensky has made explicit. He does want to start attacking targets inside Russia because he thinks that the way to leverage a good outcome for Ukraine is to put political pressure on the Kremlin, and that's done by making the Russian public anxious about the special military operation. Because at the moment they are almost entirely insulated from its consequences. And in that sense, what happened in Belgorod is clearly a success. So I do understand people's anxieties and a frustration about the thumbnail and how we thumbnail things more generally. And that sort of notion of clickbait, it's a really difficult one. It's a difficult one to draw the line. What counts as too clicky and what's sufficiently clicky. And but I've got to say, I think the content of the video itself is pretty solid.
Makes up for that.
Yeah, and I think that we do, in a way, justify the title by talking about the relationship between those attacks that have happened in Russia, not just what happened in Belgorod, but basically every single one that's happened since April 2022, and how Kiev talks about those attacks. Yeah, sorry. Again, but
it's interesting.
It's just a lot of ranting going on at the moment.
There's a lot of stuff happening.
There's a lot of stuff happening. So yeah.
Great.
Nice, yeah. Should we see if we've got anything else that's controversial?
Is there anything else controversial?
I think we actually just haven't had a controversial one for ages.
We've had a couple of good ones the last week, though.
Yeah, it's been spicy.
Yeah,
it's always fun. I think that's it. Can we do one last one?
Sure, what do you want?
One last one that I think, I'm personally interested in this, but it doesn't show up on the like-dislike ratio.
Yeah.
And we get a couple of accusations over on TLDR Global about being anti-China.
Yes.
Because we always do videos like China's economic crisis and all that sort of thing. It's a real YouTube thing. And the reason I want to talk about this is just because I think it relates to the thumbnail clickbait thing, which is that when we did, for example, like China's unemployment crisis, explain, actually, maybe a better example is we're doing a video on China's local government debt crisis.
Yeah.
And that's talking about how essentially to meet GDP targets set by Beijing, local governments have to take out lots of debt, and to inflate their GDP figures, they spend it on infrastructure projects, which those are very good because they count towards your GDP target, but unless your population is essentially sufficiently wealthy and the demand for this infrastructure is there, they don't actually bring productive returns.
Yeah.
So they end up just increasing your net debt burden. And we're going to tie to that, like China's local government crisis explain. And people are going to be like, what, China crisis explain? China's economy is fine. But and we say that in the video. I end the video by saying, this is probably not going to lead to a full-fledged debt crisis. You're not going to see like 2008 in China. That's just not what's happening. Debt burdens are still bad. They still distort the economy in annoying ways and essentially provide a drag on growth.
Yeah.
But the conclusion, the actual content of the video, I think is pretty balanced. We're not doing one of those like, China economy collapse video with Xi Jinping looking sad and bombs in the background or whatever they are. Yeah, we're only a couple of months away from that. We're not doing that yet. But it's one of those where, annoyingly, those thumbs just do pay dividends.
Yeah.
But I think the way we justify it is by saying that, of course, the thumbs always relate to the actual content very, very directly. But the conclusions themselves are normally far more balanced. And I think our analysis of like the Chinese economic situation is usually pretty measured. And we never conclude by saying like, this is the end for Xi Jinping, And equally, people always say, well, why are you so critical of China? Why don't you be mean about the US? We would if people watched our US content, but they don't.
One cares.
So we don't do US videos anymore.
People really don't care.
People hate the US. We should talk about that next in 2 weeks' time.
We talked a while ago about potentially killing the US channel. But I think we did without ever really discussing it here. Yeah. But for the reasons we discussed in that editorial episode, so we kind of covered it. But yeah, it's interesting. Even potential transitions into daily and into global, limited data thus far, but people just don't want it.
Yeah, I know.
It's weird.
I don't blame them to be honest. I'm bored of the US as well.
Yeah, I'm not overly hyped about caring about 2024. So
no, but yeah, if it's a Trump Biden, I'll be sad.
Yeah.
What a note to end on, eh? That's good. We could just.
Thanks for watching.
So deflated.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye.
Goodbye, bad Baltic takes.